Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for my LPL week number 2 overview and analysis video. Power rankings are of course going to be at the end as well. A couple of caveats for this one that I'm not going to have to do for a lot of these weekly recaps. The LPL has actively changed what games are in what week in the middle of the week, and so one of the games that I will be covering here today was originally supposed to be a quote-unquote week 2 game. It's now still a week 2 game, but all of week 2 has turned into week 3 because week 1 was just the first series of the year, etc, etc. I'm still titling this week 2 because that makes the most sense to me. It's the second week that we are covering here on the channel, but shout out to the LPL for actively changing what their schedule structure looks like in the middle of the season. Really love that they ended up doing that, but with all of that aside, we are going to be going over the, I guess, end of the first half here, everything before the Chinese New Year and everything before that second half, like, breakthrough. A lot of these teams are going to lock their spots into the playoffs. Remember, with the group structure, you just have to get top 2. If you can start 2-0, and if everybody else in your group or 2 other teams in your group are starting 0-2, it's over. It's doomed, and we are definitely going to see that a couple of times by the end of the video. A couple of these groups will very much be decided, but let me know what you guys thought of all of the action down in the comment section below. Who do you think's doing well? Who do you think's not doing well? What players in particular are impressing you, and who do you think might be able to rebound better for spring that might not be playing well at the current moment? Because we're already getting to the point where there's not a ton to play for, and it's really the spring split where you have to really start stepping up, because that's when teams start to get eliminated for the rest of the year. But without further ado, I don't want to waste you guys' time. Let's jump right into the content. If you are new to the channel, what we are going to do here is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 16. There are definitely going to be some changes, definitely some interesting things to go over. But again, there's a big break in between now and the next, I guess, stretch of LPL games, and so we're going to have a lot of time to think it over and a lot of time for these teams to be able to start leveling up again, because it is still very early on in the year. We're not even to February yet. So without further ado, let's get into our first series, and again, this is kind of a holdover from the real week number 2 or week number 1 or whatever you want to call it. At the time, it was a part of this week. They have now retconned it to have been a part of last week, technically, so apologies for that, but we are kicking it off with a Group D matchup between Invictus Gaming and Ninjas in Pyjamas that I think pretty surprisingly NIP is going to pick up a win in. They win 3-1 in this series. I shouldn't say, like, crazy surprisingly. Invictus is not a team that I would expect to ever be consistent. We talked about that going into the year. Most of that to me was going to get pinned on someone like The Shy, just because that's naturally what he is in the regular season, but honestly, Rookie has been wildly inconsistent over the last couple of years. His carry performances have been phenomenal. He has absolutely gone out there and dominated when he is winning, but go especially look at that top esports year. Not everything was going right for him in 2023, and even last year he had so much responsibility that he was kind of throwing away games at some points, and that's kind of what happened here. This was just a bit of a mid-gap, and it was in favor of the man who was coming out of retirement, coming out of streaming to get back into pro play, Doan-B, who is going to get my player of the series. How do you not give it to Doan-B here? I get that Leave was super flashy, and PP God, I think, also had a really excellent series, and the bot lane being good for NIP is so important towards their success rate for the rest of the year, but Doan-B was the guy, and he was the main character for this team. He drafts Lee Sin mid in game number 4. This is the Doan-B that I love and remember. I'm so glad that he's back just from a playstyle perspective. He is one of the most fun players to watch because he is willing to bring out a lot of these weird random picks and make them work at such a high level, but even more than that, like, the macro game is just still really, really good, and NIP did a really good job of controlling the map once they did get a lead. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm picking Lee Sin mid and dominating on it. Like, the Akali game, it was pretty good. Like, the Jace and the Ryze, they were really good as well. He was just really consistent throughout this entire series. The Ryze, in particular, was excellent. I think the Jace was really, really good. People are going to look at that Lee Sin game because it stands out a little bit more, but Doan-B was pretty fantastic throughout this entire series. You couldn't really ask for anything more from a player coming out of retirement, you know, essentially a couple of years after he wasn't even particularly good the last time he played on LNG. Didn't have great synergy with players like Tarzan. So really, really great re-debut here, and this is a gigantic win for Ninjas in Pyjamas because getting first first in this group now becomes so much easier. And honestly, you're now favorites to get first in this group. IG was really the only team that was going to stand in your way in that regard, so Doan playing so well and getting that player of the series here, that's ginormous. But again, I want to give a big shout out to the bot lane. Still some things that need to be cleaned up. PP God is really good, and I think getting him in the building with Leave is the best thing you could have possibly done for Leave individually as a player, because as we know, this guy is just so greedy, so aggressive. He's going to make one mistake every single game at around 20 minutes that just kind of puts his team back a couple of steps, and that wasn't entirely avoidable here. It's never good when your AD carry is leading your team in deaths over the course of a series, but PP God is very much trying to get that mechanical ceiling out of him, and he's been really good at doing that in the past for players like Photic that I think are actually pretty comparable to Leave. Very mechanically talented, but makes a lot of mental mistakes. If you can get a good year out of Leave, and that being, you know, what exactly he was in this series, like if you can get what he was here against Gala and Mako, one of the best bot lanes in the world, that's pretty fantastic. Like, Leave was really, really good here, even if he still was a bit too greedy for my taste. PP God did a great job of wrangling him in, and his mechanics are excellent. It's never really been a question about whether or not he's talented enough to be able to play at the top of the standings. It's about whether or not he can clean up the, like, bad parts of his game, and at least so far here, that looked pretty good. But it was definitely Doanby and the bot side that were good. Not that Shanji and Aki were bad, just that they weren't nearly as noteworthy. Doanby was definitely the standout, and Leave and PP God, I think in a lot of other circumstances, would have been the primary options in a series like this. But it's huge, huge win for NIP, and it's not a particularly good loss for Invictus Gaming. This is not really how you wanted to start this super team era. Obviously, things are still kind of in your favor to go right. You just have to get top 2. You don't have to be number 1 in the group, but you probably wanted to be number 1 in the group, just considering the expectations coming out of the offseason. And, you know, if you were looking at a team like this underperforming in series number 1, you could probably point to a lot of different areas. I'm not sure you would have pointed to Rookie, who is going to get my dud of the series. This feels entirely obvious to me. He was not good in the back half here, and he was especially miserable in that final game, game number 4 on Azir. People are going to look at the shuffle at the end of the game that was truly horrendous, like actually just an immediate int, and he killed himself, and the game was immediately over there. Like, that's obviously a really bad play, and it's like a noteworthy bad play, but he wasn't good before that in that game. It's not like he was actively being useful on the Azir and then just kind of ran it down at the end. He was losing super hard to the Lee Sin, 1v1 in lane, and then just couldn't really do anything, and he wasn't good on the Aurora either. Rookie has series like this every once in a while where he's just not particularly consistent. Again, we talked about it a lot when he was on top esports, even a bit when he was on Ninjas and Pyjamas last year, but he's gonna have to be better. Like, he can't be the worst player on the Rift and have this team expect to be a Worlds team. That's not really possible. He has to be one of the top 3 to 4 mid laners in the region, and he just did not put up that kind of performance here today. I think the Shy also struggled. Like, people are going to give him a little bit more of a pass, and I understand that, but don't give him a pass for Game 3 on the Jax. That was really bad. I get that the Game 4 wasn't nearly as bad as Rookie's, and that, you know, people are going to talk about how Rookie basically made the Shy play in the mid lane and just kind of killed himself for no reason, but the Shy definitely wasn't great in the middle part of this series, even if he was a little bit better in Game 4. Gala and Mako kind of got outplayed by Leave and PP God. That's not a very good sign. These two need to be on the same page. They basically have to be one of the best bot lanes in the world for this team to reach its goals, at least in my opinion. You know, Jeje was the best player on this team, and I don't even think it was ridiculously close or particularly close here. You know, the Pantheon maybe wasn't quite as impactful, but at least he was going out there and trying, and his Xin Zhao game in Game 1 was kind of the catalyst for them to be able to take that first game so easily, and so that is a good sign. Like, Jeje getting his form back and being a lot closer to what he was in 2022 than what he was in, you know, 2024, obviously, when EDG was just kind of a disaster, is necessary for this team to succeed, but it's got to be everything. Gala and Mako have to be good enough. Ricky and the Shy have to be good enough, and at least for now, there are still question marks there, but really, really big win for NIP. They are now very much favorites to win this group. But then moving on now to the official first series, I guess, of week number 3, or whatever you want to call it, the movement into the new week. It was Ultra Prime taking on JD Gaming, JDG getting their debut here in 2025, and it's everything you could have possibly asked for and then some. There were a couple of mistakes down the stretch. I'm not saying that everything was perfect here, but there were a couple of key ingredients that you were looking out for, most notably the core of this team looking good, that being Scout and Pays, that being the big like duo acquisition over the course of this offseason for JDG, and if that's what you were looking for, boy, howdy did you find it in this series, because they were electric. They were excellent. We're going to talk about it. Pays was unbelievably good. He actively just dominated Ultra Prime. It wasn't even remotely close, and, you know, for Ultra Prime on the other side, I still think this team is interesting in a vacuum, but they're just not going to be interesting against good teams, because the bad players on this team are significantly worse than the good players on good teams, or even, you know, the average players on good teams. It's just going to look very rough when they play, you know, a team like JDG, who's one of the best teams in the world. world because they just don't really have the talent to go into that, and they rely a lot on their mechanical ceiling. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is very obviously Pyjamas. I mean, what a dominant debut here from, a player that I think a lot of people were, I'm not going to say concerned about coming into the LPL, but, there had been some reasonable question marks about, was Pyjamas created by Gen G? Was he a product of the system that he played in? Was he good because he got to play with Chovy and Canyon and, Lehens last year, and Keen got to be on top side to take a lot of pressure away? Like, was that the reason that Pyjamas was successful? I was very much in the camp of no. I think Pyjamas is one of the top 580 carries in the world. At a bare minimum, he's been my MVP both in 2023 summer and 2024 summer of the LCK, even if he has at times struggled without resources. But this is not going to be a team that is afraid of giving him resources, and yeah, the mechanics are real. Like, you don't have to worry about that being a concern. This guy can absolutely obliterate the LPL, and I get that it's just Ultra Prime. I get that it's not exactly the most dominant team to beat in the entire universe, but if you wanted a statement series, 22, 2, and 22 across 3 games, yeah, that's pretty statement-esque. That is about as dominant as you could ask for. This was perfect from Pyjamas and, a fantastic debut, and it's not like his partner in crime in Scout in the mid lane was bad at all. He was also really excellent here, pulling out things like the Mbessa mid. We're seeing a lot of melee mids in this Fearless format in the LPL, and I do think that actually benefits someone like Scout, who does want to play for a lot of these engages in the later half of the game. He has a really good game sense for how to take over in that regard. He's obviously great on mages, but it's the 5v5 instincts that he has, or like the 3v3, 4v4 late game instincts that he has that make him a special player, and that really works on things like Mbessa just as much as it does on things like Victor, even if they do have different styles. Ole's probably going to be on tank duty for a lot of this year, as he was in this series, but if your carry duo in the mid and AD carry roles are going to be so dominant, if Pyjamas is going to obliterate people like he has been in the LCK, like this was MVP Pyjamas. This is the player that I've been calling a top 5 to 10 player in the world all of last year. And Scout continues to show up and be one of the best mid laners. That's going to be very difficult to deal with. Missing was really good here. Like I said, Ole did really well on tank duty, was never really a liability. Jiang is really the only way that Ultra Prime is going to be able to win games, in my opinion, this year, and just kind of taking him out of the game and not letting him snowball, that was gigantic. If you're looking for something to criticize, Shun was being very aggressive for a lot of this series. I think for the most part, it's fine. I think he realized that this team was just going to win no matter what, and he was limit testing a bit. We've seen him lock it in. It's not like this is a player who has always just been super flippy or feast or famine. When he was on BLG, he could have that style, but there were a lot of times, especially at Worlds, where he was just picking Maokai and Sejuani and just, playing for the team. I imagine in more serious games and more serious matchups, he is going to be able to do that. But for now, like, he wanted to play Nidalee, he wanted to play Zyra, he wanted to play Wukong, he wanted to be a little bit more of a main character. Didn't necessarily always work out, but Scout and Pyjamas were certainly good enough to be able to turn the tide around. I'm not worried at all about JD Gaming. A lot of the concerns I think we could have had for them, I think a lot of them were dispersed by how good this series was. And then for Ultra Prime on the other side, it really is very difficult to try to analyze them because they just didn't really have a lot of options in this series. It got better as things went along, like games 2 and 3, I think were a little bit more open-ended than, say, game number 1, game number 3 in particular. At least the pace kind of slowed down, and they were allowed to do something, but dud of the series might actually be going to somebody that you are surprised to see because of the scorelines. It's going to be Junhao. If you just looked at the KDAs for a lot of these players, not only in the full series, but each individual game, you would think that Junhao was really the only one attempting to do anything for Ultra Prime, but watching the tape, boy, this guy was just not good. He was taking every single resource on the map for himself, not giving any to his laners, not giving any to his, bot laner, his 2v2 or anything like that. He was taking it all to try and get himself fed, and then he was doing absolutely nothing with it, was losing fights, 2v1 in his favor, and it's just not good. Like, his mechanics are just really, really awful. He doesn't really seem to have a great game sense. I've been very underwhelmed by Junhao. I did rank him as my worst jungler coming into the year. That has very much played out. This guy has not been good at all for Ultra Prime, and I think that's the unfortunate part. Is I think this team does have talent. I like Jiang quite a bit. I think Saber's been fine. I think Wacko is somebody you can win with. Rosie Love is not particularly impressive to me, but like Jiang and Wacko I think are good, and Saber I think is fine. This jungle is going to keep them from winning games. Like, they might be the worst team in the entire league purely based off the fact that Junhao is not good, because not only is he like bringing the team down in terms of being the worst player on the Rift, but he's also siphoning resources from his own laners to lose the game on his own. It's really, really a bad combination. So not a good look for Junhao, and not a good look for Ultra Prime, I would say in general. They might need to look in a different direction soon, because I don't know if you're going to be anything other than a bottom 2 team that's out in spring if you keep rostering this guy. Like, I hate to say that, but oh my god, like, the tape looks awful in his first couple of performances, and just a lot of mental mistakes. Everybody else was just whatever, like they were outclassed. Jiyoung didn't get to play the game because he was playing Renekton into Maokai or Jackson to Ornn or whatever, right? Like, there's just not a lot of ways for him to be able to affect the game, and that is Ultra Prime's strategy. Wacko was not as good as Pays. As much as I like Wacko and think he could be an average ADC at this level, like, Pays is really good. Saber and Rosie Love were just not good enough to play against Scout and Missing. Like, this isn't a shocking outcome. Ultra Prime is supposed to get 3-0'd by JDG. I'm just shocked by just how bad Junhao is, and just the way that he's bad is really concerning. But huge win for JDG, just to solidify that, yeah, we're pretty good. Obviously, I'm not going to put a ton of stock into it. I'm not saying they're number 1 off of a win over Ultra Prime or anything like that, but to just know that Scout and Pays in a perfect scenario can show up and can dominate as a duo, it's very encouraging, and basically everything you could have wanted to see out of JDG in their debut performance. Then moving on to our third series, and we're moving to Group C, and this is such an important outcome for both of these teams to get a win in. It's Edward Gaming taking on Thunder Talk Gaming. And Thunder Talk is going to pick up the 3-1 win. This team is legit. At this point, there's really no denying it. I can't even tell you why they're good. It's really hard to watch these games and pinpoint exactly what is going right for them. But it's going right, man. Like, it is absolutely going right. I think they're obviously kind of a positive in the sense that they're taking down teams that are struggling at the moment. But they took a best-of-1 game against JD Gaming. Not all that bad, even though best-of-1s are very finicky, as we can see in this series with EDG winning game number 1. Best-of-1s can really go in any direction, but beating LNG, beating Edward Gaming, these are teams that were expected to be better than them, and Thunder Talk obviously has not performed particularly well. With this roster, they lose their best player for a player that has not been succeeding elsewhere, and all of a sudden, they're one of the better teams in the LPL. It's actually insane to watch, but credit to them. We'll try and diagnose what exactly has changed for them moving in to this season, but for Edward Gaming, they're just not good. Like, I was wrong about this team. I can't even really say anything else. Xiaohao is mega stuck once again because the rest of this team continues to really struggle with any sort of consistency. A lot of people are calling them like herbivore team. I don't agree with that. First of all, Xiaohao's really good with resources and he is getting a lot of them. And so, calling them like a full team of herbivores, I don't think is fair. Angel is a player who has gotten resources in the past. Tasum is a player who has gotten resources in the past. They're just not doing that right now. And we'll talk about that. There just doesn't really seem to be a lot of synergy or cohesion on this team really in any way, shape, or form. But for Thunder Talk, I mean, how do you not give 1xN player of the series here? I think that there were other options. Satab was awesome in game number 4 on the Yasuo, like genuinely incredible. It's actually crazy how good he was there. He wasn't perfect throughout the rest of the series, and obviously his reputation is not particularly good going into 2025 after last year, but he has been awesome at the start of this year. It's been everything you could have wanted for Thunder Talk. He's not been UCal. I'm not saying he's dominating games in that same way. He's not even really been the primary option for this team, but the fact that he has even been like a positive at all, the fact that he can go up against a player like Angel who's been to World Finals and like beat him 1v1 in the Yasuo LeBlanc matchup, that's really, really good for Thunder Talk and a really important thing. Beixuan was excellent in this series and honestly very under talked about. He was the guy controlling basically everything in games 2 and 3. That Sejuani game in particular in game number 3 was phenomenal and really, really good to watch. I really don't want to undersell how good Beixuan has been at the start of this split. He mega gapped Weiwei in their first series, and he was just as good, if not better, in this series against Xiaohao, who was playing better than Weiwei was. It's been a really impressive start for Beixuan, who I think has easily been the second best player on this team so far, but the best player is 1xN, and I know I've been a little bit negative towards 1xN on this channel. Maybe a lot of people in the comments would say I've been a lot of bit negative. I haven't necessarily said that 1xN is bad. I just don't think that the hype is necessarily there for him to be like a top 3 or a top 4 guy. I know that there are a lot of narratives out there, especially by the LPL casters, talking about how 1xN is like next up to be a superstar, like similar to Gala, and like that, trajectory that he had in the LPL. I still don't really see that in him. I think that this was a fantastic series for him, and he is going to get player of the series. One thing I do want to point out, though, is sometimes it can be a bit hard to, like, talk about whether or not it's 1xN or whether it's the enemy when they are constantly walking into his traps over and over and over again. It feels like EDG was so off their game today. Assume, in particular, was just so greedy and so bad with his positioning that 1xN had so many free leads, and, obviously he did a great job of pushing that, and good players are able to create free leads for themselves, but, I don't know how repeatable that's going to be against actually good teams that are playing actually well. We'll have to see, right? Like, all of their wins are over teams like like LNG and Edward Gaming that have their own inherent problems. Of course, that best of one win over JDG is kind of keeping that narrative hope alive that they can be a top 5 team, but if they are, 1xN is going to have to be the guy. He's going to be the primary option on this team. It's very clear now with UCal gone that 1xN is like number 1 in terms of the resource options, and that's really good for ThunderTalk. If you can get the most out of him, which is just like an above average AD carry, like if you're getting a top 5 to 8 guy in the league, that's phenomenal. If you're going to get someone around like slightly better maybe than what Hope is for anyone's legend, like obviously that's a huge positive. We've seen what Hope can be at his absolute best, and so I'm certainly not trying to shit on 1xN. I just don't know if he's going to be, you know, ruler one day. Like, I don't know if I see that in him. People are talking about him like he's Jackie Love. I don't know if he's Jackie Love. We'll have to kind of take a wait-and-see approach on that, but this was a good series. Like I said, Satab Beishuan, good. Feather has been really solid. He was excellent in their first series against LNG, and he continues to really propel 1xN forward. I think that's a big reason why this bot lane has looked so much better, as Feather has also improved a ton, and 1xN, I think, is being given, obviously, more opportunity to shine. Hoya is still just whatever, but he's not the worst top laner in the league. That's for damn sure, like he has been the last couple of years. He's at least tried to stabilize, and so it's crazy to see this turnaround for ThunderTalk. Players like Beishuan and Satab and Hoya, like even if you did like 1xN and Feather going into this season, even if you did think they were going to be an above average bot lane, like could you have really said that ThunderTalk was going to be a really good team with that top side? It was hard to say, but all of them are playing so well. Jungle mid has really been excellent for this team, and if that's going to be able to keep up alongside this bot lane, yeah, I mean they're going to be a top, 5 to 6 team in the LPL, which is genuinely insane to say. And then for Edward Gaming on the other side, like I said, the cohesion on this team is just obliterated. This very much feels like every Xiao Hao team ever, and at some point I have to start looking and asking if it's his fault that everybody really starts to kind of destroy themselves around him, because he individually performs so well and he is so relevant in a lot of these games. He wasn't perfect in this series. I'm not trying to say that he was like elo held in the same way that I've seen from some other players in this series, but he was pretty good, I would say, on EDG, certainly their best performing player, and it's just everybody else is a disaster. Angel feels like he is the bad version of him from the beginning of the summer split, from that like group stage part of the summer split on OMG. Assume was a nightmare in this series. Wink was also really bad. It just feels really, really weird right now. Assume is obvious choice for dud of the series. I don't know what was going on in his head, but the mental part of the game has like completely disappeared from him. I'm not sure if it's just like bad communication with the rest of the roster, or if he's just lost a lot of confidence going into this split, but holy crap, this is the worst I've seen him play in quite a while. I would have put Assume and 1xN in pretty similar tiers, both like slightly average to slightly above average, AD carries that I think could grow into more, could grow into being top 6 or top 7 guys by the end of the split. Like, Assume is just not even close to that in terms of the performance he gave here, just not respecting 1xN's satchels at all on the Ziggs, just not really gaining any sort of resources, playing really, really slow on things like Kalista Nico. It just feels very strange. It didn't feel like a very good like mental series. Hopefully Assume can turn that around. Like I said, Angel was also really bad in this series. When you're getting gapped by Satab, that's not great. Yone looks like it's going to be a pretty big priority ban for Angel throughout the rest of this year. If that's something that actively affects him, that's a huge issue. Wink I thought was really awful. The Elise has not worked out. We'll just say that. Like it's maybe theoretically good in certain circumstances, but you kind of have to just be the better support in order to make that work. That was not the case here. And again, they played the Kalista Nico so passively in that final game. It was just so frustrating to watch. And then ZDZ, while he was good in game 1 on the Cassante, and him and Xiao Hao do seem to make it work when they are winning, he looks awful when they lose. He continues to be one of the weaker top laners in the league at playing from a negative state, and that's against Hoya, who's like not good really in any circumstance. So Edward Gaming is just not who I thought they were going to be. I felt like this team was going to be able to make it click with Xiao Hao kind of being a primary option, both Angel and Assume being super comfortable in that secondary role. It's just not happened. Xiao Hao is once again the guy who has to do everything on this team, and that's just not a recipe for success, as has been proven in the LPL in the past. But for ThunderTalk, this team is legit. I'm not guaranteeing that they're going to be top 6 or anything like that, or top 5 or anywhere in that zone, but they could be, and the fact that they could be is genuinely astounding, running back the fact that they are 4 players from last year who were awful and not particularly good, and the one player you did bring in was considered to be a massive downgrade in the mid lane. It's genuinely insane how this team has gotten better. If jungle mid is going to be this good throughout the rest of the year, and if bot lane is going to step up and really have that breakout, 2025, ThunderTalk is going to be a team that basically everybody has to watch. But then moving on now to our 4th series of the week, and man was I excited for this. It is a bottom of the table clash, in my opinion. The 2 worst teams in the entire league, Team WE taking on LGD Gaming, and LGD is going to throttle WE. And you know what? If you were ever up in the air about who the worst team in the LPL was, I think it just got proven. think we all should have not overthought it. I didn't overthink it. WE is the worst team in the LPL. They put together a bunch of players who were bad in a bunch of previous stops, and who would have known it? They're bad together. It just does not seem to be working out. They were everything gapped. There's going to be a lot of like negativity thrown in a couple of players' directions, but I'm serious. Like, everybody on this team deserves that criticism. Every single player on this team deserves to be talked about as if they are really struggling. For LGD, obviously, this is a nice win. It means they're not last in the group, which is cool. It probably doesn't mean anything outside of that because I do not imagine that the team is going to be competing to get out into the top 2, but this was a good performance, and I do think there are things to be excited about when it comes to this team. It's just not quite at the same level as, you know, like beating WE is easy. Beating everybody else is going to be a little bit more difficult. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, kind of up in the air. It should go to one of the members of the jungle mid, in my opinion, either Climber or Zhao Qinghua. I'm going to give it to Zhao Qinghua just because I think he was probably more important throughout this series, even if his scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that. You know, Climber going 15-1 and 31 across 3 games is incredibly good in that Pantheon game in particular. In game number 3 is going to kind of edge a lot of people in his direction, but I think Zhao Qinghua was unbelievably good on the Talia in game number 2, and he was still good on the Yone, still really good on the Orianna, even if he was caught out a bit too much. Like, generally speaking, I think he just was the most important player for LGD in this series, and that's important to say. I think whoever you want to give this to, whether it's Climber or Zhao Qinghua in the mid lane, they're the 2 players that I highlighted in my primer and at the beginning of the year as the players that needed to step up for LGD, the players who I had the highest expectations for in terms of this roster. I really did not think very highly of the bot lane. I thought that they were going to be one of the weakest in the entire league. That still might be true. They're just going into the worst in the entire league, and then Saucy was somebody who was kind of hit or miss for me. He had good moments, he had bad moments. I just wasn't guaranteeing that he was going to be good basically from day number 1. He's actually been pretty solid. That Rumble game in game number 1 was excellent, but the jungle mid was really the focal point of where I was expecting to look to see some positive improvements here from LGD overall, and I absolutely think they offered that in this first series. Again, the Talia game from Zhao Qinghua in the mid lane was excellent, and the Pantheon is really going to stand out for a lot of people for Climber. Pantheon also, funnily enough, really climbing in popularity, pun entirely intended here in the LPL. It's actually really, really popular right now, and we'll see if that ends up sticking or moving over to other regions. Just something to note because I don't think a lot of people anticipated that before the year. So jungle mid looking excellent. I think YCX also deserves a big shout out for that Seraphine game in game 3. Seraphine's looked very successful so far in pro play, the very limited amount of times that she's been played, especially in Fearless. I think that that's a champion that can actually do really well. Xiaoya really struggled in their first series at the beginning of the year. It's nice to see that this bot lane can at the very least beat up on Taiyun and Vampire, who are just completely unplayable at this level. And Saucy was also excellent. Like I said, the Rumble game was awesome, but he wasn't bad on the Mbessa or the Jax in the back half of this series. He was just better than Cube across the board. This was an everything gap for LGD, and the fact that you're saying that is good for LGD. Unfortunately, the negative takeaway is that it's probably more to do with WE than it is with LGD, who is just awful. People, again, are going to point to Taiyun being a disaster, or Vampire playing particularly bad, or Karis kind of running it down at the end of these games, or whatever, right? Cube giving up. It's everybody. This is a literal everything gap. You cannot point to one player and say that it's their fault in this series. You don't get 3-0'd by LGD Gaming in under 35 minutes every single game if everybody on the team is not just completely running it. Like, truly, this is the worst team in any major region at the current moment. I don't know if they're going to win a game as a group of 5. Like, genuinely, that is still something that I'm just not sure is on the table for them. That's how bad I think this team is in relation to the rest of the league, which is a really bad sentence to say. That being said, I have to give a dud of the series, and to me, it is going to go to Taiyun because he is the worst player on this team, even if everybody else is also incredibly bad. You know, Vampire's getting some, like, restraint, as he typically does on Reddit, because Reddit loves to defend Vampire, but it's not like this guy's helping out. Like, this guy's been horrendous. He was okay, I would say, in their first series, but this one was not good. You can't really defend this performance. This was not a particularly strong one. Tianjin was miserable, still super aggro, super aggressive, willing to trade 1v1 all the time, except he's not actually getting any ones. He's just trading 0 for 1 in a lot of these instances. Cube has completely mentally given up. I honestly don't even know why he came back to pro play. It was very clear that he was already mentally checked out when he left WE and went to OMG the first time. The fact that he's back here again, like, is it literally just to collect a paycheck? I genuinely don't know why he's here, because he's not even trying. Karis somehow, some way, was the only player even remotely trying, but he was only trying in laning phase. He was so awful in in team fights that I don't even know if I can sit here and say that he played well or that it was like the best player on the team. Like, it feels really hard to say that because he was throwing the game in a lot of these team fights. And so overall, this team is just bad everywhere. Like, Taeyun is obviously the worst because he's picking Caitlyn and getting absolutely dominated in lane, which is just completely unacceptable. His mechanics are miserable. He doesn't really have any game sense. He's the worst player in any major region. I feel pretty confident in saying that at this point. That was already the take going into this year, and that's been kind of doubled down on. He's no longer a C- player. This guy's in the Ds in terms of his grade. Like, he's just awful. He should not be even remotely considered for a top level team, but yet he still continues to get offers and jobs. It just astounds me. But it's not just him. Like, it's everybody on this team. WE is a disaster, and there's really no way for them to be able to salvage it, in my opinion, unless they make some wholesale changes. And, you know, it's good for LGD. I think they're going to feel very lucky that they got here into Group A because I don't think they beat a lot of other teams in the current state that they're in. But, you know, if that's what I'm saying about LGD and they came out here and obliterated WE, they made it not even close, that is certainly something to keep in mind. But then moving on now to our 5th series of the week, and it is finally time for our first 5-game series of the entire year. It's JD Gaming taking on OMG in Group B, and JDG is barely going to squeak out with a 3-2 victory here. Man, this was close, and OMG actually played really well in this series. I think there are a lot of encouraging traits to come out of OMG here. I'm not going to completely give up on this team. Starry is as good as advertised. That is simply what I will say. I think Lin Feng has a couple of great moments. Moham was excellent here today, but at the end of the day, JDG was just a little bit better. When you've got the star power of JD Gaming, you're able to come out on top in series like this that maybe are coming down to the wire, but all of JDG's wins were very dominant, especially down the stretch. Games 4 and Games 5 were incredibly dominant for JDG, where they definitely looked like the better team. So let's get into it. Player of the series to me is pretty not in doubt. It's got to go to Scout. Rhyming there was crazy, but Scout was excellent here. Lin Feng actually put up a really good fight, I would say. He was off of a lot of his more signature picks, things like the Yone and the Akali that were for Scout in the latter half of this series, and I think that did end up hurting Lin Feng. He tried to counter it with things like Set and things like Silas. Obviously, he knows the things he doesn't want to play into on those champions, but Scout is simply just so good that he's able to overcome any bad matchup, any bad situation. He was just in such a good spot throughout this series, and you know what? This carry duo looks very, very legit. We talked about it already earlier on in the video and earlier on in the week that these two played well. You know, in their first series, they played even better, I would argue, in this one because the stakes were a lot higher. So credit to Scout. Really loved the way he played the back half of the series, again, specifically the melee games at the end. But Pays was still excellent. It's not like you want to take anything away from how good Pays was kind of a hard carry in the back half of some of these games. When you're looking at game 4, you know, the Yone got a huge lead, but the Kog'Maw was the one who ended up taking over. The Jhin was actually super impactful in game number 5 by Pays. You just want to give a lot of shouts to, you know, Scout and Pays, who are kind of the core of this team. They were the two players that reportedly everything was built around, and you know, they were a very sought-after duo in a lot of the offseason. LNG obviously feeling like they wanted to bring both of them in, but they ended up choosing here instead. They are working out as a duo. They clearly have great chemistry as a carry duo, and if they're going to keep that up, if they're going to be one of the more dangerous mid-bot like duos in the entire world, then yeah, JDG is going to be one of the best teams in the world, and they're going to make a run for the finals. Missing continues to have very good chemistry with Pays. I imagine this is pretty similar to working with Ruler. I don't imagine it's entirely different. Ruler's obviously a different player in terms of his style. Pays is much more focused on playing like the late game team fights, whereas Ruler was kind of the mid game monster, if you will, wanting to take a lot of those 3v3 skirmishes. But Missing, I think, has adapted well to playing with Pays, and this bot lane looks great. Ale, I think, is fine on the top side. Harry made this decision, we'll talk about it, to just pick tanks every single game and to say, screw it, I'm just going to play weak side top lane every game, and he just assumed he was invincible. He was walking up first in a lot of these team fights and instantly dying. Ale was a big part of like wearing him down and not really allowing him to get to that inevitable stage on a lot of those champions in the laning phase. And then Shun, you know, he continues to be a player that I'm still more concerned about than maybe everybody else on this team, but not actually concerned about. He was better, I would say, in this series against OMG. Not nearly as many head-scratching moments as he had in that game number 3, you know, previously this week against Ultra Prime. But at the end of the day, like, Shun is going to be fine. He always steps up in big moments. He's actually been really good domestically in the playoffs for BLG in the past couple of years. And if Scout and Pays are going to dominate, yeah, this is going to be a pretty easy road, I would say, overall, for JDG, at the very least, to number 1 in this group. group. And for OMG, you put up a really good fight. Like, this is a good loss. I know it feels bad to say that. Like, is there really such a thing as a good loss? But the big question marks coming into a series like this were Hang and Moham, and I think both of them were super integral towards the success of their wins. I think Moham was unbelievably good throughout basically all of this series, specifically on the Rakan in game 1, but on the Leona as well in game number 3, where he was influential. And Hang, I think, was super important on the Nocturne in game number 3, playing that Nocturne Orianna combo. And then Linfeng and Starry, I think, both stepped up. You kind of knew that they were going to be fine. Linfeng was a bigger question mark to me than Starry was, if only because he just has less of a track record at this level, but he has been good. He was taken off of some of his more comfort picks and still looked pretty solid, but the set coming out in game number 4, the Silas coming out in game 5, these are the things I would expect him to lean into if they're not going to give him his comfort picks, like the Yone and the Akali. But Starry is the star of this team. Again, pun entirely intended. He is the guy they're building around and the one they really want to push forward. It reminds me a ton of 1XM over on Thunder Talk, where the best case scenario for this team is them just giving him all of the resources possible. I just don't think the rest of the team surrounding him right now is as good as Thunder Talk's, surrounding situation, which I think is genuinely insane to say, because that's not what I would have expected at the beginning of the year. But dud of the series is pretty obviously going to go to Harry. Already talked about this, 5 straight games of tanks on the top side. I think that's generally fine, and honestly, I don't think that that's even like a nightmare situation for a team. I think if you have a player who's good at playing tanks, you should put him on tanks 5 games in a row, because they are kind of good right now and a little bit underplayed. But he thought he was invincible. Like, dude thought he was going to be able to walk up and just tank everything when he was playing these tanks. I'm sorry, that's just not how modern League of Legends works. There's too much damage in the game. You're going to get blown up if you try to make that decision, and Harry very much got blown up throughout this game, and he just was not useful. Ale was keeping him from really scaling out of control in lane, and then he was dying super early in all of these fights. He was a very easy choice for dud of the series for me. I think some people could theoretically give it to Hang for that Poppy game in game 5, which wasn't really all that good, but he was pretty good before that, especially on the Nocturne, and I'm not going to throw away the entire series just because he didn't play well in game number 5, but OMG putting up a real fight against JDG. This is a good sign for OMG, and maybe there are some reasons to be concerned if you're a JD Gaming fan, because they lost a best of 1 to Thunder Talk and Demacia Cup, and now they're, being taken to 5 by OMG. Like, all of these things aren't exactly great on their own, but the way that they're getting out of these situations, I think, is entirely justifiable. Scout and Pays are looking genuinely phenomenal, and if Shun can just clean up some of the mistakes, I think this is still going to be one of the best teams in the world. Then moving on to our 6th series of the week, and this was probably the one I was most excited to see the outcome of, because it could really determine Group A and a lot of things moving forward. It was Anyone's Legend taking on Top Esports, a rematch of the Demacia Cup finals, and just like in those finals, Anyone's Legend is going to pick up the win here, except I think you could argue this one was even more dominant. This was a really good series from AL. This team looks super legit right now. They looked very similar to this at the start of the summer split last year, and that's definitely going to be the direction that I'm going in terms of my mental. But if they're able to keep this up now with Tarzan in here, who's like notorious at being able to keep teams on track, and obviously Tabe coming in and being able to coach them, that's going to be absolutely ginormous, because if you can harness this form, like, this is finals form. This is easily the best team that this organization has ever seen, if you are going to get that out of them. For Top Esports, a lot of people are catastrophizing, as they typically do. I know I get criticized on this channel for talking about Top Esports fans. If you're a big Top Esports fan and you watch my channel, I'm not talking about you, because you're very respectful to me in the comment section, and I understand not all Top Esports fans, but the Top Esports fans on Reddit, oh my god, dude, I've never seen a group of people or a fan base of a specific team like catastrophize as much as Top Esports fans do. The sky is not falling. Everything is not a disaster. Everybody on this team is not unplayable. It's genuinely insane to see some of the reactions to this series after this was the team that just made finals at Demacia Cup alongside AL. It's genuinely crazy for me to see, so we'll get into that, but we got to talk about the winning team first. We got to talk about AL first. Player of the series to me, it's got to go to Kale in the support position. What a phenomenal series from KL as a support. Obviously, I've been very high on him for a very long time. 2022 was a ginormous breakout for him in terms of, what he was for that sandbox team. I know Prince got a lot of the headlines. Even someone like Krakow, I think, got a lot of attention. Even Closer got more attention on that team than someone like Kale did. But he was really the cog that made that entire engine turn on sandbox back in 2022. Ends up, not really having a huge role on sandbox in 2023. Comes over here to the LPL last year and is pretty good. Him and Hope have like a really good bot lane duo synergy. They're not like dominant, but they're solid, top 5 or top 6, somewhere in that area. This could be the breakthrough that I've kind of been waiting for that kind of puts him into that upper echelon of all supports in the world, like a top 3 or 4 support in the world. I think that's the kind of upside that Kayle has, and I think this was the kind of series that shows that that's very possible. He just straight up outplayed JackeyLove and Crisp, and I get that everybody hates Crisp, and he's like a super easy target, and he's very easy to look at and blame because he has been a scapegoat on every single team he's been a part of, but he was not the issue in this series, and I will get into that. There were a lot of issues for Top Esports in this series, and Crisp was probably number 3 for me on the team in terms of that. Kayle just outplayed him. He was just better, and that's not Crisp's fault, and no one's blaming JackeyLove for the fact that Kayle completely outplayed him in a couple of fights. Hope outplayed JackeyLove as well. The spot lane was just really, really good, and Hope is a part of that, but Kayle is definitely the one that I think is rightfully grabbing a lot of the attention from these moments. I think Tarzan continues to look incredible. This guy might be the best jungler in the entire region. It's actually absurd what he can do when he's winning. He is like so consistent. He's so good at being able to generate early pressure, and he's so good at being able to close that out. He has a great head on his shoulders in terms of macro. I would argue that's his best defining trait. Obviously, he is a very mechanically talented player, but, it's the facilitation that he does at such a high level that makes him a difference maker, and Kanavi didn't really stand a chance. He completely outplayed him in this series, which, again, kind of puts Tarzan into that upper echelon in terms of junglers for me. Shanks was just better than Cream. Shanks has almost always owned Cream. It's very funny how this matchup has always gone, even going back to like the WE versus OMG matchups from like 2021, 2022, like when Cream was Crime, like Shanks has always just been beating Cream. Like, I don't know if he just has some sort of hidden dark tech. Some players just beat other players really consistently. I'm not going to blame Cream too much in like a long-term sense. Now, if this becomes a lot more realistic, then I will start to talk, but Flandre was fine on the top side, but if AL just needs to keep this form up. The problem with AL has not been their high moments, it's been their consistency in the past, and if you can get a full good year out of Shanks, and if Tarzan helps solidify that this bot lane can really emerge as a top 3 or 4 one in the entire region, yeah, this is going to be a finals contender because you have more than enough talent surrounding them to be able to do that. But for Top Esports on the other side, again, people are just catastrophizing how bad this series is. I think they played fine, all things considered. Game 4 is going to leave a sour taste in people's mouths, but the rest of the series really wasn't all that bad from them. There were mistakes. I think jungle mid is definitely where I'm looking at as like the players that got outplayed the hardest. Cream is going to get my dud of the series here. He was not very good, and I'm a big fan of Cream. I've been a defender of the progressions that he's made in his game. I think people call him like Zeka Light, but I think in that sense, he's actually, he is that in my eyes. I just think highly of Zeka, right? He's not this guy who can only play assassins in the way that like Zeka Light would entail. He's Zeka Light in the fact that he is really good at assassins, is really good at developing his skill set in other areas, and has grown a lot in those other areas, and has actually gotten to the place where he's way more consistent than people give him credit for. That's what I think of when I think of Zeka Light, and I do think that applies to Cream. He just gets completely obliterated by Shanks. Again, this has happened basically every time that these two have played. I don't really know what the deal is with that. Again, maybe it's just a mental thing for Cream, but hopefully he can bounce back the next time he shows up on the Rift. And Kanavi, I think, is going to go underrated for how bad he was in this series. He made a lot of weird plays and just wasn't particularly relevant in the early game. Tarzan was kind of running a lot of the map here and definitely was controlling the back half of this series, and I blame a lot of that on Kanavi, who was not even trying to contest him in a lot of those circumstances. So yes, Crisp does deserve some criticism, but like, I don't get it, man. Like, he is like the scapegoat every single time, and he makes bad plays, but every support makes bad plays. I don't know how you can look at Crisp and how you can look at like On, or how you can look at even someone like Carria over in, the LCK, who I do think both of those players are better than Crisp, but not by like a ridiculous amount, and see like entirely different circumstances. I see the Crisp is Beryl. Like, they're the same player. They are literally identical in terms of how they end up playing the game. They're feast or famine, and when it works, it looks great, and when it doesn't, it looks bad. Like, you just have to accept that. That's just what support is. I think TES fans got a bit spoiled, respectfully, last year when Mako was here because he just was good at everything. Other supports aren't that. Like, there aren't a lot of supports in the world who can be Mako. Crisp is what Crisp is, and you're just gonna have to live with it. It's very similar to what they had. It's like a better version of what they had with Mark in previous years in the past. But JackeyLove also made a lot of mistakes here, was pretty far forward, did not look particularly great here. 369 wasn't really all that relevant. Top lane in general wasn't really all that relevant in this series, but to me, jungle mid stood out more, specifically mid lane, as kind of the crux for why it was so hard for Top Esports to win. Not trying to say that Chris played well, just that I don't really know what you would have expected out of a player like that in this circumstance. I don't know why people are so surprised that he's not played particularly well when the team is losing. He's not a good player at playing from behind. Neither is really any support in the LPL outside of Mako. So I think Top Esports is going to be fine. This is a really tough group. AL has proven themselves to be very legit. Top Esports got to the finals of Demacia Cup for a reason. I still think this is very reasonably a top 4 team in the LPL. I just think AL might be a top 2 team in the LPL. That's genuinely how good I think they are right now. Power rankings are definitely going to shuffle around at the top, and AL is going to be a big benefactor of it. But that's going to bring us to our 7th series of the week, and typically speaking, this would be the last one, but we're doubling up at the end on the final day here. To kick it off, we've got a matchup between LGD Esports and Bilibili Gaming that BLG is going to absolutely obliterate. I mean, they have played 2 series, and they have looked utterly dominant in both of these series. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is the best team in the league right now, and it's not even remotely close. There is a gap between number 1 and number 2, regardless of who you put at number 2, because they are the team to beat. It is genuinely insane just how well they are playing at the current moment. LNG stood absolutely no chance. Obviously, this team is already struggling in a lot of different areas. They lost to Thunder Talk last week. They lost to Thunder Talk at Demacia Cup, which was obviously not ideal, but losing to BLG, probably the least concerning of those, even though they got obliterated in all of these games. Obviously, they're just completely outclassed. A lot of these players just don't have the skill set to be able to go toe-to-toe against BLG, and that is a concern because I do think this team was kind of wanting to be near like top 6 or top 7, like somewhere in that range. They're just not. This is a bottom, 6 or so team. Like they're somewhere in that range, bottom 6 or bottom 7. This is not a playoff team, which obviously, we know by now with a lot of these standings ending up being locked. But let's go ahead and get into what actually happened. I'm probably going to wrap this one up relatively quick because this was a blowout. There's not really a lot of analysis to give. Knight was the best player on the Rift, and it wasn't even remotely close. He's player of the series, and oh my god, like his Azir in game number 3, that might be the best Azir game that I've seen in a while. The dude obliterated Haichao on Corki in lane in game number 2 against Ione. It's actually absurd how well Knight played in this series and just how good he is individually as a player. Haichao is not some scrub. Like he is one of the more interesting players, I would say, on LNG, even if he hasn't necessarily shown that at the beginning of this split, but Knight just made him look like an absolute fool in games 2 and 3 in particular. Not that game number 1 was bad at all, just that was specifically the game that he made him look like an absolute scrub. It's actually insane. Knight's just crazy. He's the best player in the LPL, and it's not particularly close. Bin is the only player who can give him really any sort of competition for that, at least in my opinion, at the current moment, and Bin, was kind of more on a backseat approach here. He's playing freaking Galio in game number 2, so, just, it is what it is, right? Like, Knight and Bin as a solo lane duo was unfair. Wei has also continued to adapt super well for this team. It's always fun seeing Wei versus Wei. Always a fun matchup there, but Wei definitely got the better end of this matchup in this one. The Viego in particular in game number 1, pretty phenomenal. Really not a lot to say in a negative way about Wei. He seems to have great chemistry with Knight. This team has slowed down their game plan at least a little bit. They're not quite as active like pre 6 or 7 minutes as they were with Shun, but I think that honestly kind of works right now with the way that the current meta has established itself. They could even be a better team across the entire year with Wei than they were with Shun, and they were 1 game away from winning World Finals with Shun. So this jungle mid looks excellent. Bin is the best top laner in the world. Elk, in my opinion, is still the best AD carry in the world, even though I think it's more up for debate than some of the other ones I've talked about. On was excellent here. He's one of the few players who has actively looked good on Elise support. I would trust On with that, though. The mechanics are genuinely insane on him as a player, so much so that he's getting 1v1 opportunities for this team to get side selection. It's just crazy to see BLG at the level that they're at right now. They are genuinely so much better than everybody that they're playing against. It's pretty difficult to even come up with some sort of like way to analyze them because their level is just so far beyond the LPL at the current moment. And then for LNG on the other side, yeah, I mean, they just didn't have a chance. Like, there's really nothing else to say here, man. This was never going to be close. It was never going to be in the ballpark, and I don't even know how much that has to do with LNG. Like, BLG already obliterated LGD Gaming, who is also kind of struggling right now, but like, who knows how good these teams actually are. Thunder Talk obviously makes this a lot more interesting, but, I mean, BLG looks like they would demolish anybody, and LNG just was unfortunately in their way at the current moment. There were a couple of players to point to. I mean, obviously, everybody on this team wasn't particularly good. I think Zico was trying on the top side. It's just hard to beat Bin 1v1, let alone be, like, the #1 option against BLG when you're the top laner. It's just really difficult to be put in that position. I don't think Wei was individually all that horrible, but the bottom side of this map was just unplayable. Haichao got completely outplayed by Knight, and he was the one who stood out the most to me in a negative way, if only because Knight was just so dominant. Those laning phases were so excellent, and he was able to control basically the entire map, the entire game. Haichao was never able to keep up with that, which is a problem. I like Haichao as a player. He was really good last year on LGD, but this is just a little bit out of his pay grade. He's not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with Knight, and it doesn't feel like anybody is right now, but Haichao especially, he's not a top, 3 or 4 guy. Like, that's what you need to be in order to even be relevant in this matchup, and Photic and Juo continue to be awful. Like, Photic is just bad. Like, he is a bottom 480 carry in the region. Like, genuinely, he is just a bad League of Legends player. And I hate to say that I'm right about that, but, like, golly, I've been talking about how bad Photic has been for a little while, and I've been too scared to rank him down there. He is not getting any courtesy from me at this point onwards. This is not a good League of Legends player. He is a player that should be, like, on the border of even having a roster spot in the LPL at this point. He just can't play. Like, his mechanics are not good enough to be able to keep up. He was given so many resources when he was on, like, Victory 5 back in the day to even be remotely successful outside of being a #1 option, which no team really wants to make him in the LPL. He's just not going to be a functional player. It's just not what he's good at. Juo, I think, is kind of being dragged down a bit by Photic's play, but it's not like he's been significantly better. He's just been kind of along for the ride. I just think Photic really is that bad. Haichao really struggling. Like, this was just one of those games, one of those series for LNG. Everything going wrong and everything going right for Bilibili Gaming. Again, it's really hard to know how much to take away from this 3-game set because BLG is so dominant, but one thing is very much for sure, there is a clear team to beat and a clear title favorite in the LPL, and it shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 2, technically week number 3, but the second real week of the LPL here in winter. It's RNG taking on Invictus Gaming, and IG is going to get their win back from the beginning of this week. They're going to pick up the 3-1 win over RNG, who does look good. This series definitely showed a lot of the good things that we saw out of them, you know, in their previous matchup, but there still are real question marks about RNG. They're not going to be a team that's guaranteed to get top 8 or anything like that, or guaranteed to get out of this group. They still are, like, underdogs, I would say, to finish top 2 in this group. I just think this team is very much playable, and I think we saw that here. But of course, the standout story is IG actually getting their act together, being able to come back from a Game 1 loss and a Game 2 that was kind of up and down, and even a Game 4 at times where RNG looked like they were going to be able to capitalize on some things and actually be able to win it. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, but really the best player on this team right now is very clearly Jeje in the jungle. I know a lot of people are going to look at Rookie and see what he did, or even Gala at the end of this series and see a lot of the pop-off carry, you know, moments from those two players. To me, it's all really about the setup, and if you wanted, like, perfect setup in this series, Jeje offered that, and he was really good earlier on in the week against Ninjas and Pyjamas as well. It just didn't really end up mattering because Rookie wasn't very good, the Shy wasn't very good, Gala and Mako got outplayed by Leave and PP God, which was kind of a disaster if we're being entirely honest. You kind of got lost in the shuffle that Jeje was actually really solid for the team. Not so much in this one, very much not lost in the shuffle. Milky Way actually did play really well on the other side of this matchup, was doing a lot of things right, and was trying to carry that final game on Xin Zhao. He just didn't really have the support. Jeje was still just really focused on setting up for his carries and making sure they were in a great spot. It's really all well and good to be Zeri or be Caitlyn in the back half of these games and take over in terms of damage, but if you don't have a Zac or a Vi setting that up for you, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Jeje really was exceptional in these games, and to me, it was a very clear choice for player of the series. Only other one I considered was Rookie, who I think was much better here in the mid lane than he was in that first series against Ninjas and Pyjamas. He's always going to be a bit more streaky, just kind of the player he's turned into, very similar to someone like Showmaker over in the LCK, where you know there's going to be at least a couple of games every so often that aren't great, but for the most part, he is still going to be a massive positive. This felt a lot more like the Rookie that we were expecting coming into the split. You know, still going to be some questionable moments, but for the most part, a dynamic primary carry option for this team. Gala and Mako also looked significantly better down the stretch. Mako's peel was incredible at the end of this series. Really, really something to, like, you know, praise, I would say. He's obviously phenomenal. We already talked about it in the top esports section. There really just aren't a lot of supports in the world that can do what Mako does, and Gala did a great job of capitalizing on that. Even if I still think he needs to get a little bit more consistent in terms of his positioning, he is a bit far forward right now. Not exactly playing, like, top level League of Legends, but obviously we know he can get back to that. The Shy was fine on the top side. Xiaoshu was actually kind of relevant on the other side of this matchup, but the Shy wasn't the problem. Certainly not. So good series overall for IG, and definitely an important bounce back after not winning that first one with all of the expectations that this organization had going into the year. But for RNG, I still feel fine about this team. People are going to look at Lele and say that he played horrible. I can kind of understand that. You know, shout out Nick at Waiting Room. He's probably going to be coming in and playing support for this team. He was picked up, you know, midway through the week. We'll see if he ends up being a starter coming back from the New Year's break. But for now, Lele, I think, was generally okay in this series, like definitely below average in the back half. You know, the Leona game, the Alistair game, they weren't very good, but the Nautilus game in game 1 was excellent, which is kind of what dissuaded me from giving him dud of the series. To me, dud of the series was Tong Yuan, because as bad as Lele was, a lot of the times he was just kind of doing his job, and maybe he went in a little bit too early, maybe he was a bit disconnected from the rest of the team, but Tong Yuan was playing late game Smolder, like 30-minute, 225 stack Smolder, and was doing absolutely nothing with it, was losing a 1v1 to a Caitlyn. Like, it's worst case scenario. Tong Yuan was just not the same player that he was in week number 1, and that was the defining trait for RNG that was going to make this team competitive to me, is if Tong Yuan could actually take that next leap forward. Milky Way was, once again, good here, and Xiaoshu, I think, played better than he did in week number 1, but if Tong Yuan and Jiachi are not going to be like a good mid-bot duo, then this team is probably not going to be near top 8 or top 9, like I think they theoretically could be if everything were to go right. Tong Yuan, that breakout last week, it had to be real, and to me, it just wasn't particularly good in this series. I don't think he was good before that, but he was especially bad in game number 4, and I think he's honestly getting under-talked about for how bad that game was. But like I said, Milky Way was fine, Xiaoshu was fine. I think he actually had a couple of really good plays in this series, and Milky Way did his best to try to carry some of these games, especially that game 4 in the Xin Zhao, but the rest of the team just wasn't really up to the task, and that's okay. Again, Invictus were major favorites going into this, especially if you would have looked at this before the Ninjas in Pyjamas series. You very much would have expected IG to be able to take this series 3-1. And so, you know, I'm not going to freak out over RNG. They are who we thought they were, and IG hopefully is who we think they are. Unfortunately, I think this team is going to be a lot closer to like what Weibo Gaming have been the last couple of years, which is a very inconsistently good team. Rookie and the Shy just kind of invite that at the current moment. Maybe Jeje can actually offer some consistency like he has at the start of this split. Mako, I think, is going to be good for that, but Gala's not necessarily been on his game at the start of 2025. I think a lot of things are going to be fine, and they're still likely going to end up as a team that is very dangerous in the playoffs, but I don't think they're guaranteed to get top 4 by any stretch. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL week number 2, I guess week number 3, overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated standings after the second full week of LPL action, and right before the New Year's break. We are going in to a couple of weeks of a break, because obviously Chinese New Year is taking place, and they always break for Chinese New Year, but we definitely have a very clear picture of where a lot of these teams end up standing. Only one group is really undecided by this point, that being Group D. Every other group has a pretty good idea of where they're going to land. Obviously, still some things to work out, but 2 of these groups are already completely decided. Half of the league is already done, and so it's pretty interesting to see that, but we can kind of go over the changes in my power rankings and just generally the standings here. Obviously, of course, every team is ordered in 1st to 4th in terms of where they are in their individual group, but any ties will just be broken alphabetically. There's only one tie right now, which is pretty good to see. Any team that's colored in green means that they have officially qualified for playoffs. They are guaranteed top 2 in their group, and any team in red means that they cannot be top 2 in their group no matter what ends up happening from this point onwards, and so we can obviously talk about that, but the power rankings are really what I want to go over, which is the number immediately to the right of each team, and of course changes how they have changed from last week to this week. For Group A, we see AL skyrocketing up. They're going to go all the way up to number 3 in my power rankings. I perhaps just wasn't in on them enough going into the year, which is crazy to say about an Anyone's Legend team that has Tarzan. That should be about as much of an instant top 1 as any team has ever been on this channel with my personal opinions, and so maybe I just wasn't going in on them enough, and now they're going to be all the way up to number 3, but Top Esports is only going to fall to number 4. I think some people are going to want to see them lower. I don't think they're worse than number 4 right now. I think this has more to do with AL being really good rather than Top Esports being really bad. This is going to be a team that competes to like go to Worlds and very much still be in that conversation. I just think AL is even more so in that conversation at the current moment. LGD and WE are not changing, even with LGD picking up a win, because I still think they're the second worst team in the league. I just think WE is that bad, like legitimately. For Group B, we have it decided. Weibo Gaming and JD Gaming are both sitting at 2-0. That means both of them will be getting out of the group in the top 2. JDG is going to move up to number 2. I know some people might see this as a little bit premature. Maybe AL should be above them. I think that that's a reasonable conversation to have. But for now, with how Scout and Pays are playing, like they deserve top 2, in my opinion. They are a team that I'm scared of, and I would project right now to be in the finals if everything were to stay the same. Weibo actually sticking at number 5 despite numbers 4 and 6 changing. It didn't feel right to keep them, or to move them down after how good they were in week number 1, but they definitely still have some things to prove. There was a reason I left them at number 5 last week, and I'm going to keep them there now. OMG and Ultra Prime not really moving all that much either, both kind of performing as expected. Perhaps you can move OMG up because they put, you know, some pressure on JDG. They took them to 5 games, but they still have very clear flaws, and to me, they're just kind of there with the rest of the teams around Edward Gaming and LNG that are just kind of fine. Ultra Prime also not really dropping because the bottom three teams are all really bad, in my opinion, even if Ultra Prime is struggling. For Group C, obviously, BLG's at number 1, but confirming their spot in the playoffs at the second seed here is Thunder Talk coming out of Group C. Not entirely surprising to those who put a lot of stock into Demacia Cup, but definitely surprising to me. They're going to move up 2 spots to number 8. They are a top 8 team in the LPL right now. I think that is abundantly clear. I just can't reasonably put them any higher than number 8 with all of the teams that are above them at the current moment, but who knows? Maybe they could keep skyrocketing up, and, their competition is going to drop. LNG is going to drop to 11. EDG is going to drop to number 10. I think theoretically, these could be 9 and 10 if you really wanted to do that, but to me, these are teams that very much fall out of that upper echelon. I just don't really see a lot of competitiveness in them right now. It's going to tell us a lot more when they play off against each other next time they end up showing up on the Rift. And then finally, Group D, this is the only one that's not really all that decided because the way the standings have worked out, the 2 teams that have played twice are both 1-1, which means that this group is still technically wide open. Couple of changes. Invictus is going to drop from number 4 to number 6. Like I said, I'm going to rank them very similarly to how I ranked Weibo Gaming for basically all of last year, which is this super inconsistent team that could at any point beat anybody in the entire league. I think that that's just generally where they're going to sit, and that's going to put them slightly below teams like Weibo and Top Esports and Anyone's Legend that I think are a bit more consistent, at least I expect them to be a bit more consistent. NIP is still going to be right on their tails, though, at number 7. I know they beat them, and I know that a lot of people are just going to AFK say, like, oh, they won, therefore I'm going to put them above them, but, I think the longer you look at this split, the more I would expect IG to get more synergy together, and I think they underperformed in a lot of different ways in that series. I don't know if I expect that series to go the way of NIP if they run it back, that kind of thing, right? Like, I would expect IG to be able to win that series still, even though NIP won it last time, which is why they're close in the power rankings, but NIP is going to stay at number 7, and somehow with their loss, RNG is going to jump up to number 9. I just think this is clearly a more competitive team right now than Edward Gaming and LNG and OMG, and, a lot of these other teams. RNG, not only do they have a shot to be able to get out of this group if they aren't able to beat Ninjas in Pyjamas, which would be a crazy upset, but they're also, like, actually competitive. Milky Way's a good player. I think, especially if you bring someone like Nickit in, I can see Xiaoshu and Nickit making a really big impact. Tong Yuan was good in week 1, even if he wasn't in week 2, so there are reasons to be excited about this team, and to me, that justifies them moving up to 9, where there aren't a lot of reasons to be excited about the teams around number 10 or number 11 in terms of wholesale stuff. And then FPX not moving, not playing this week. Still don't think they're particularly good, but those are my power rankings. Those are my standings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 2. Player of the week was super obvious for me. It's going to go to Pyjamas, the AD carry for JD Gaming. He just was phenomenal across this entire week in both of the series that they ended up playing. JDG was, of course, the only team to play twice. I guess technically Invictus Gaming, but depending on how you want to word that out. But Pyjamas was unbelievable, and to me, this was the most obvious possible selection for player of the week. The only other player I even kind of considered was his teammate, Scout, who was also really excellent across both of those series. I think it should go to one of the 2 JDG duo carries. To me, Pyjamas was a little bit more impressive, but if you wanted to give it to Scout, I think I can understand that as well. These 2 look dominant right now playing together. And then other runner-up, the other honorable mention kind of has to be Knight right now in the mid lane. He just absolutely obliterated Haichao and LNG so much to the point where I really don't think there's a lot of conversation surrounding that. He was the most dominant one series player across this week. Maybe you could have given some sort of credence to a Jeje, who was really good in both of the series that he played, but to me, Knight was more dominant, and he definitely, it would have felt like a snub if I didn't put him as at least an honorable mention on the player of the week with how he played. But dud of the week for me is actually maybe shockingly going to go to Junhao. I think there is a really strong case to be made that this should be Taiyun, who was just horrible for WE, but lucky for Taiyun, Junhao was even worse to me for Ultra Prime. Again, his score lines look pretty okay. He went 10 and 10 in that series, but he was such a hindrance in terms of he gathered all the resources for his team, hoarded them all for himself, didn't give any to his teammates, and then solo lost the game for them. Nobody else had that kind of impact on their own team this week, and it's especially frustrating because Ultra Prime had a good jungler last year in Hacker who had maybe the best year of his entire career. It's really frustrating to see Junhao be so disappointing at the current moment. Hopefully he can turn it around or at least get coached to play a little bit more for the rest of the team, but for me, he's the choice for dud of the week in week 2, and Pyjamas is my choice for player of the week in week number 2. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. We will be back with LPL content when they are back in a couple of weeks, but we've got a lot of content in the meantime. We're covering the LCK. We're covering the LEC. We're covering the LTA North. The primer for that went up yesterday. We're going to be covering all of that on the channel in the meantime, so hit subscribe and hit that bell if you are interested in that content so you can see when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all